You can say exactly what Frozen is about. So it's propaganda. A truly mythologically based story, you can never fully say what it's about. Yeah, and they didn't need men, and God, give me a break. Just because you need men doesn't mean you have to like them.
Yeah,
I'm an evolutionary biologist, by the way, not a political philosopher. And if you show a rat, a cat, somewhere he doesn't expect it, he will run back to his burrow and scream for 24 hours. Evolutionary biologist, by the way. I think that's I really do believe this, although it's very complicated to explain why. I really believe that's a representation of DNA. Let's party!
Hi, Lance and Dave.
Wow, Professor of Philosophy, Ben Burgis.
Silence! But seriously, let's not get too fixated on academic credentials, because the lobster that we're going to boil here has all the academic credentials you could ask for. He holds a tenure position at the University of Toronto. As a matter of fact, though, he's a doctor of psychology, and nobody really reads him for the psychology.
We need some logic. We need some bombs.
He did write a book about psychology. And absolutely nobody reads that book. Here's how I know. There is a story in that book that comes pretty soon at the beginning of the book that is the single funniest thing that I have ever heard about Jordan Peterson, and nobody ever talks about this, which tells me that nobody read even this far into Maps of Meaning. So he tells the story of how he first became interested in Jungian psychology, which is what he's into. And it starts out with this whole thing about how he used to be a socialist, but then he realized that socialists were actually bad, that they like the poor, but they really just hate the rich. And he said he got this out of reading The Road to Wigan Pier by George Orwell, which Orwell himself would be very disappointed to hear Peterson say that, were he alive, because Orwell was a lifelong socialist. In any case, whatever socialist group this was that Peterson was part of, and he hypes it up like it was some revolutionary communist sect, but knowing Peterson's penchant for hyperbole, it's entirely possible it was just the NDP. Even after he quit, he was still political enough and still left-wing enough to be really concerned about the issue of nuclear war and nuclear disarmament. In fact, he had this year where he was having these really intense dreams about nuclear war. He was reading everything that could explain these dreams. And so, of course, one of the first things he turned to was Sigmund Freud's book, The Interpretation of Dreams. But Peterson says that wasn't doing it for him, right? That Freud wanted to make everything about sex, but these dreams, you see, they didn't have anything to do with sex. They're about politics. They're about nuclear war. Hold that thought. The one and only one of these dreams that Peterson actually gives as an example in this part of the book. It starts out, he's watching TV with his cousin, who he parenthetically describes as the most beautiful woman that he has ever met. And then something goes wrong. He goes down to the basement. The bomb goes off. Right there, there's some forbidden sexual stuff going on. Bomb goes off. I don't think you have to be Sigmund Freud to read something sexual into this, but let's keep going. As people are walking around in the charred chaos outside, things have gotten really crazy. Dogs are walking around on their hind legs. So every time you see Peterson talk about chaos, remember that's what he imagines, dogs walking around on their hind legs. If we just had total chaos. And the dogs are exchanging cooked meat for canned food for some reason. And he makes this exchange, and then Peterson realizes at the end of the dream that the cooked meat is the cooked flesh of his hot cousin. Yeah, nothing Freudian going on there.
Derrida himself regarded, and Foucault as well, they were barely repentant Marxists. They were part of the student revolutions in France in the 1960s. And what happened to them, essentially, and what happened to Jean-Paul Sartre for that matter, was that by the end of the 1960s, you couldn't be conscious and thinking and pro-Marxist. There was so much evidence that had come pouring in from the former Soviet Union, from the Soviet Union at that point, and from Maoist China, of the absolutely devastating consequences of the doctrine, that it was impossible to be apologetic for it by that point in time. So the French intellectuals in particular just pulled off a sleight of hand and transformed Marxism into postmodern identity politics.
Everything he just said is false. Everything. There was no revelation about the horrors of Stalinism and the Soviet model that happened between 1968. All that stuff happened way earlier than that. 1956 is when Khrushchev gave his famous speech denouncing the crimes of Stalin. It's also, by the way, since one of the figures he mentioned was Jean-Paul Sartre, the year that Khrushchev sent tanks into Hungary to suppress democratic socialist uprising against Stalinism in that country. And Sartre wrote a whole book about that invasion and his break from capital C communism because of that. Long before 1968, Sartre was an anti-Stalinist Marxist, as were most of the Marxists who were involved in the 1968 student uprisings. And let's not even get into the conflation of postmodernism and identity politics as if those were the same thing. They're not the same thing at all. Not only is Marxism exactly the kind of grand narrative they're rebelling against, that the Marxist narrative about, the relationship between history and class struggle and feudalism and capitalism and socialism, but it's actually one of the primary ones a lot of these guys had in mind. And one of the reasons why, Foucault, for example, and somebody who was actually still very much a Marxist after 1968, like Jean-Paul Sartre, couldn't stand each other. Let's see what he said when an actual Marxist thinker, the economist and podcaster Professor Richard Wolff, challenged Peterson to a debate.
There's this professor, I think his name is Wolff. He put a challenge up on YouTube to me a couple of weeks ago to debate him. And what did he say? He said, he criticized my criticism of Marx. He said, well, that Peterson, he's basically stuck in 1989. It's like, we've progressed way past the time of the Stalinists. It's like, and I thought, well, how about if a Nazi said that? Just out of curiosity. It's like, well, it's not 1945, anymore. It's like us National Socialists, we've progressed way past what happened in Nazi Germany. It's like we should don't be stuck in the past, right? It's time to give us another chance. It's like, well, how about no? How about well, we have the Soviet Union with the 20 million dead there, and we have Maoist China with God only knows how many people were killed there, and we have Cambodia, we have Vietnam.
Just like his knowledge of the history of ideas is hopelessly confused, his knowledge of plain old history is just as bad. That is amazing, the way that when he's, rattling off Stalinist horrors, as if Richard Wolff was a Stalinist and not an advocate of democratic socialism and, in fact, expanding democracy by putting it into the workplace, which is the opposite of the top-down Soviet model. He just casually equates Vietnam, Cambodia, as if those were basically the same thing. Communist Vietnam invaded Cambodia to stop Pol Pot's killing fields. The United States, for Cold War, anti-Vietnam, anti-Soviet reasons, actually backed the Khmer Rouge against them after fighting off a U.S. occupation that killed, depending on the estimates you wanted to believe, between 1 and 4 million Vietnamese peasants. what the US did in Vietnam was quasi-genocidal with the Khmer Rouge, who the US was backing. So this is just, I don't want to pull any punches here, abysmally stupid. There were Stalinist atrocities. The people who carried them out did say they were Marxists. Of course, you might think, all right, well, Jordan Peterson's very interested in Nietzsche, and the Nazis tried to claim him, so I'm not quite sure why Nietzsche is not out of bounds the way that Marx is. Not that he should be, because the Nazi claim on Nietzsche was absurd. Nietzsche hated anti-Semitism and German nationalism and went on about both frequently. Marx was a consistent advocate of, free press. He was opposed to censorship. He was opposed to the death penalty. Marx's example of how dictatorship of the proletariat would work was the Paris Commune of 1871, which was such a radically democratic experiment that it was supported by both Marx on the one hand and Bakunin and the anarchist wing of the First International on the other hand. And in fact, not only did Marx not support any dictatorships, as far as I know, there's exactly one head of state who Marx liked enough to ever send a nice letter to, and that was one Abraham Lincoln, who Marx sent a congratulatory telegram to on behalf of the First International at the time that Lincoln was reelected president. Postmodernism and identity politics and Stalin and Marx, maybe for all of the things those things don't have in common, maybe there's some common thread that Peterson has identified. Once we understand that common thread, then we'll see that, okay, despite all the things that he's getting wrong, Peterson has some kind of insight into some of this.
We know that things can go too far on the right. And we know that things can go too far on the left. But we don't know what the markers are for going too far on the left. And I would say that it's ethically incumbent on those who are liberal or left-leaning to identify the markers of pathological extremism on the left and to distinguish themselves from the people who hold those pathological viewpoints. And I don't see that that's being done. They're driven fundamentally by a horror of inequality and the catastrophes that inequality produces. And fair enough, because inequality is a massive social force and it can produce catastrophic consequences. So to be concerned about that politically is reasonable. But we do know that that concern can go too far, the doctrine of equality of outcome. And it seems to me that that's where people who are thoughtful on the left should draw the line. Say, no, equality of opportunity, not only fair enough, but laudable. But equality of outcome, it's like, nope, you've crossed the line.
Philosophically illiterate. In other words, you're attributing a claim to a thinker that if you had read even some of his shortest and most accessible writings, you would know is just wrong. If you're going to go around giving lectures and recording videos where you spout off about Marxism and how horrible Marxism is, you should probably read at least the Critique of the Gotha program, because one, it is the one place where he's getting into a lot of these issues, and two, it's super short and accessible. Marx explicitly says that in the early stages of a socialist society, you would need to have unequal distribution of resources to incentivize work, incentivize certain kinds of economic contributions. Those who are able to work, you'd have to have unequal payment for the purposes of incentives. Obviously, there's nothing about having collective ownership of the means of production that's incompatible with saying that, yeah, we're going to have somewhat unequal distribution to incentivize certain kinds of things, because at that stage you're going to need to. After a certain amount of time, as technology progresses, well, it would play out differently than how it plays out under capitalism. Under capitalism, when technology eliminates certain categories of jobs, or you need fewer employees, some people lose their jobs and they're in temporarily desperate circumstances, or maybe permanently desperate circumstances, depending on whether they can find a new job. But of course, if workers controlled the means of production, distribution, etc., then technological changes could play out differently. Everybody could just vote themselves fewer hours, but the amount of resources created would stay the same. It would just be that you would have to spend fewer and fewer hours of your day as things progressed, doing tasks that you wouldn't necessarily have chosen for yourself. You think that Marxism is fundamentally wrong, and equality of outcome is not something that we should desire. That, in that, like, you say, okay, Marx didn't advocate equality of outcome. It's yet another thing that Peterson is just fundamentally confused about. But whatever, the Marxist stuff is crazy anyway, and equality of outcome is bad too. So even if Peterson is wrong to associate the two together, he's right to reject both. Here's the problem with saying that. Equality of opportunity to equality of outcome, trying to draw any kind of sharp line between those two is just going to be a hopeless project, because as anybody with any knowledge of how the world works should realize, think about the college cheating scandal that just happened, and then think about the fact that with no cheating whatsoever, no violation of any rules, the children of the well-off have a much better chance of making it into college than the children of the poor. There is no meaningful distinction there, at least in an intergenerational way, because one generation's outcomes are the next generation's opportunities.
Wow, thanks, Ben.
Your logic has destroyed yet another
Oh, thanks, Ben.
Your intelligence knows no bounds, and thanks to you, we can rest easy.
And keep our heads high on campuses everywhere.
And you washed away those tears. You are the L'Oreal of people.
What does that even mean?
Don't you remember those old commercials where it's like, L'Oreal, no more tears? Because it was like shampoo for kids, but it wouldn't get in their eyes.
Do you ever feel that your skin needs more skin? We now have a large range of products that are comfortable, fantastic, and will make us feel like complete sellouts. Visit the T-shirt store. If you're a fan of Ben Burgis, and we know you are, and you want to sharpen your mind grapes, check out his new book, Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left.
Thank you so much for watching, guys. Thanks for sharing, liking, commenting, subscribing. If you want to hit the little bell button at the bottom, it'll let you get our videos as quickly as they're produced. Dave here is indicating exactly where they are in the new YouTube. Yeah, YouTube's changed once again, I'm sure, as you guys all know, thanks to the of all people. They're ruining yet another platform, but it is what it is. So thank you so much.
Yeah.